Okay, so before we start this video, I do have a confession. I did actually sit down and, record a whole video about what I read in January, but I never got around to editing it. So in this video that is including January and February's reads, I may reference about that recorded video, whether I said something or did something or just talk about it in general. So I feel like I should tell you, I did record a video about January's reads. I never got around to editing it. So just a forewarning, because it happens. Hey guys, I'm Abby. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going over the books I read in January and February, or basically just all the books I read this year so far. I have quite a few of them, so I won't go in like major details of them. I don't want to like also spoil anything for anyone if they want to read these books. Some of them were pretty new when I read them, and some of them are much older. But overall, I really enjoyed all the books I read throughout both months, so I can't wait to talk to you about them. And I'll probably go in order. Luckily, since it has been 2 months, I wrote down everything on my little like handy book tracker markers so I can reference them to remember kind of like different things about each book. And I'll probably go in order of which I read them, starting from the first book I finished in the year up until the book I finished yesterday at the end of February. So let's get to it. So the first book I finished in January was an audiobook, and I actually started it, in 2021, obviously, late, and this is a book I've read many times but never actually listened to the audiobook, so it was a little different and I really enjoyed it, and that's my favorite book, which is Pride and Prejudice. And I listened to the Audible version read by Rosamund Pike. And if you don't know, Rosamund Pike is the one who played Jane in the 2005 version of Pride and Prejudice. So the whole time I was listening to this, I just really wanted to watch this movie. There are a lot of books in the past 2 months that I've read, and basically I wanted to watch a movie or it reminded me a different movie. But this was a major one because it did have an actress in one of the movies reading the book. But other than that, I really did enjoy her narration. She did a really great job of doing each character. One thing that made me really enjoy listening to the book instead of reading it like I usually do was that usually when I'm reading, I know certain parts, I'm like, oh, I don't like this part as much, I'll like skim over it. But this, I had to really kind of listen to them, and it made me really pay attention to all the other parts that I usually just kind of skim over. And so I really liked that. It made me kind of feel I was almost reading the book again for like one of the newer times, like maybe not the first time, but like the second or third time. It was just kind of a different way of consuming it that made me rethink about the book in a new light, sort of. If you've never really been able to get into audiobooks, which I'm still struggle with them every once in a while, I suggest picking one of your favorites and seeing if they have a reading of it. I really enjoyed listening to this one. And so maybe that's an option for you to like try out audiobooks, is like listening to your favorites, or like go to classics that you like and listening to the recordings of them. And listening to this audio recording of Pride and Prejudice made me really want to listen to the other audio recordings of Jane Austen books. There's actually still a few I haven't read, but I think I've read well over half of them. But I would like to go and see if I also like the recordings of their versions also. So that's maybe how I'm gonna probably get myself to listen to more audiobooks in a more regular schedule. But the second book I read was actually a brand new release book for this year. It was released like January 11th, I think. Yes, January 11th. And the book is called The Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sue Lynn Tan. And I actually happened to pick this up from the library, like on my ebook app, the day it came out. I had seen some emails and stuff about like promotions of it. It looked very interesting and one that I wanted to check out, and so I was very happy I got it kind of like on the first day. But I remember talking about this in the last video I recorded, and I rambled on about it because there's so much that happens in this book, and I couldn't remember if it was because it was just like a YA book and it's been a while since I read like a more YA focused book, or that's just like her writing style. But things moved so quickly in this book, and like there's so many different like, I don't know, plot points or like things that happen to lead where it ends. It is a duology, and I definitely will read the second book. I did enjoy this book But one thing the whole time I was like, wow, this is moving very quickly. But it does create a lot of like action scenes and a lot of kind of movement. One thing I didn't like about the fast pace is that the relationships between the characters, you're just kind of told they develop over the time that is passed instead of like reading about it developing. So I felt like the characters' relationships were like not substantial for you to really get as a reader or like see them develop. You're just kind of told they're developed. And so it's a little harder to get behind them, or I don't know, like sense the depth of them. But that's kind of one of the only things I didn't really like about this book. Other than that, there is like a really good plot, even though it moves very fast. There's a lot of action scenes, like I said. And also, at the very beginning of this book, it is based off, you know, the daughter of the moon goddess. But the moon goddess, the fairy tale or mythology behind the moon goddess in China is used a lot throughout this book. And it reminded me so much of this movie on Netflix. It's an animation movie. I think it's called Over the Moon. I watched it a long time ago, but it is based off the same mythology fairy tale of the moon goddess. And so reading like the very first part of this book wanted me to watch this movie again, which is funny because I just got over, you know, Pride and Prejudice and wanting to watch that movie all the time of listening to that book. So having this one right after that want me to watch a different movie, it was really kind of funny in the beginning of the year. I was like, I'm reading all these books, but now I just want to watch all these movies. And that didn't end there. It moved into like March, or not March. It moved into February with my other books too. So, but I do recommend that movie. It's very cute. It did make me like tear up at it. But with this book, I really enjoyed the mythology incorporated in it, and not just the moon goddess part of mythology. She added a lot of other Chinese mythology within this book, because it is very, I would say, more high fantasy, or very high fantasy for this. But I didn't like that she incorporated all this mythology and kind of fantasy within the Chinese culture within this book. And I can't wait till the second part of this duology comes out. I definitely will read it and see what happens with all the characters. But the whole plot of this book is following the moon goddess's daughter. She's like hidden away. Something happens where she gets found out, or it's almost she's discovered, so she has to like escape and run away, and ends up kind of becoming a servant, and then through that like goes to a competition to eventually become the prince's companion or like friend. Eventually they fall in love, and then she eventually joins the army, and like all these things happens while she's in the army. And it's this, like I said, a lot happens, and so it's hard to like explain the plot because there's so many parts that go on. Eventually there's like a love triangle between the prince, her, and this other dude who's like in the army with her. And then there's this whole evil force that they had to fight, and she's like fighting all these mythological creatures that are really like bad and stuff. And then she's like the whole time striving to like help release her mother. And so it's a very like big epic tale. So if you're very interested in that, I highly recommend this book. But I enjoyed it overall. And that was The Daughter of the Moon Goddess. The third book I finished in January, or this year, was also a newer release. I think it was released early December of 2021. But that was Beast of a Little Land by Joo-hae Kim. And I really enjoyed this story. It's a very more serious story, differing from the Moon Goddess. This story follows two people, a boy and a girl, and kind of like throughout the years they grew up, and it's like their whole relationship and their relationships with other people, how their lives intertwine a lot. But the whole setting is in Korea, mostly in Seoul, during the Japanese occupation, and then the war, and then like the years afterwards. So it's like a very serious, hard time for these two people. There's also like side characters who are Japanese who have it a lot easier, but the girl becomes a courtesan and follows her life. I think she eventually becomes an actress. And the boy who's in love with her, but she doesn't love him, he like becomes like a leader of a gang, and then becomes a part of like the Communist Party and like fighting against the Japanese, and like part of the like revolutionary movement kind of within Korea during the occupation and the war. You know, the story plays a lot on the title of, you know, Beast of a Little Land, and like who is really the beast in the story, and like deals a lot with morality and like what's right and what's wrong, especially during times of war and occupation. There's a lot of like kind of blurred lines. So I found this story very interesting. It is very kind of a little sad just because of the time period and like the things that go on. It can be like heavier topics and things to read about, but overall I really enjoyed this book. Would definitely recommend it if that's kind of a topic you're okay reading about. There are characters who die, and while I was reading it, it did remind me a lot of a book I read I think last year called Island of the Sea Women, and it's, you know, about the same type of thing of you know, Koreans throughout the occupation and the war and the things that happen afterwards. So if you've read the book and liked it or were okay reading it, I would definitely suggest this one. It's kind of has a very similar feel to it. It's very sad at points, but overall a very good story. I believe this is the debut novel for this author, so I think she did a really great job, and I hope she comes out with more that I would definitely check out. She did a great job of like developing her characters. I really, even kind of the side characters, I really kind of felt connected or could kind of understand their point a lot. And overall the book's just really well written, and so I can't wait to see what other works she puts out. And the next book I finished in the year was actually my family's book club book that we chose, and I think this is the last book I finished in January. That is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, I think is how you say his last name. But this was also about during the World War II, or the war, just instead of in Korea like Beast of Little Land, this one is set mainly in France, and it also follows a little girl and a little boy and how their lives intertwine as they go throughout the years of before the war and then the building up of the war. One is a blind French girl who lives in Paris but then has to move to the coast to escape, you know, the Germans, and the other is a German boy who doesn't really agree with, you know, Hitler and his theologies and stuff, but is forced to kind of fight for the Germans. And they're very connected through like radio and their family members, and that like people within their lives are intertwined, and there's a lot of connections in between them, even though these characters, unlike Beast of Little Land where both the main characters meet a lot throughout their lives, these characters only meet once, but somehow throughout their lives they both save each other's lives. And I would say this book has a little less sadness to it than Beast of Little Land. There are sad points because it is, again, a war and a lot of things happen, but overall it doesn't have a sad feeling. But this book jumps like back and forth between times. So throughout the whole novel they're talking about this one kind of like raid on the city where their little girl lives, and it like slowly goes throughout the time of what is happening, but in between the like small jumps of time, they go back in time to like describe points in their lives of where they kind of like connected, or like how they got to this point of being in this city where they finally meet during this bombing. So the author did a really great job of like building up this moment to like when they meet. Even though the moment in the book is very kind of short, I think he did a really great job of doing the jumps in times and the points they were at. The only thing I didn't like about this book was the end. It wasn't like a bad ending, but it wasn't what I wanted. It was very kind of almost shocking the way he like went with it. It kind of frustrated me because I don't know, I just wanted it to end very differently than I did. I won't say it because I don't want to like spoil the book for anyone who wants to read it who hasn't already. But since it was my family's book club, we talked about it, and I think they agreed with me that we all liked it until the very end when like the last like main action happens. It was very frustrating. And we were all kind of like a little shocked about it. So that was like the only part of the book that I didn't really like, the way he turned it at the end. Just so it didn't happen or end the way I wanted it to, but it was good overall. I would say the ending didn't ruin the whole book for me. It was just not what I wanted. It was a very good book, very good writing. A little sad just because it is a wartime themed book, but I didn't feel sad like overall throughout the book. But the build up throughout with the story was very good, and I enjoyed the writing too. So those were kind of like the 4 books I read in January, and now going into February, I kind of went with a theme of my reading for January or February. Of course, you know, Valentine's Day is in February, so it has a very big theme of love, and then I kind of took that with my reading. I basically read almost all romance novels this month, and at points I was like, maybe I should just read a different type of book, but I made it through. I basically only read love romance novels, and I enjoyed it. I might take a break now from them for a while, but overall I did like it, even though there were thoughts of like overboard, of like too much romance. I pushed through and I read them all. So just a fair warning, we're talking a lot about romance books going forward in this video. For the first book of February that I finished, I decided to kind of continue within a series that I started last year. And this one is the third book in the series. There's 8 in total. I read 2 more this month. So the third one is An Offer from a Gentleman, and it is part of the Bridgerton series. If you know, the first season of Bridgerton is on Netflix, and that's after watching that is when I read the first book, and I read the second, I think sometime late last year. But now I've read the third. This story is about the second oldest Benedict girl. He falls in love with Sophie, and this one I really enjoyed more than the first 2 of Daphne and Anthony. This one, at the very beginning, you can tell it takes a lot of like Cinderella-esque story plot points. A father who dies, an evil stepmother with her 2 daughters who are like also rude to an extent, which is one part of it I really enjoyed. It doesn't follow it exactly, but it does. You definitely notice it has, you know, Cinderella written all over it. But I did enjoy that part of the story. And so far, this is my favorite of the Bridgerton series. You haven't heard a lot about Benedict until this story, so I really enjoyed it, sort of, I guess, getting to know his character a little bit more. And I liked the relationship between the 2 main characters, and also throughout this story you get to learn a little bit more about, I guess, the Bridgerton family. Like, obviously in the first 2 you learned a little bit, but you know, as you get further in the series they talk about them more. She actually doesn't talk about as much the like Anthony and Daphne, who are already married and stuff, from the first 2 novels as much. She mostly talks about the younger siblings, and you get, I guess, like introduced to them a little bit more. But I guess from this third book of the series, it made me want to read more of the series. The first 2 were like good and okay, but this one made me like, oh, maybe I will actually finish this series because I enjoyed it more. But yeah, that was the first book I finished in January. The first romance read of February was just a continuation of reading through the Bridgerton novels. So the next book I finished was also a romance book. Obviously, as I said, I read a lot of romance books this month of February. This one was probably my least favorite of this month, or actually this year. It wasn't a bad book, but I don't know, I guess I just didn't like it as much. But it was The Wedding Date by Jasmine Guillory. But I think the reason I didn't like this book as much is that, like, while I'm reading a romance book, there's like a point where, you know, the couple gets together or whatever, and usually at that point I'm like really excited. I'm like, oh, finally they're getting together and whatever. But when it happened in this book, I was just kind of like, okay. I don't know, it just it didn't give me the feels as much as when I read other romance novels. I don't know if it's because when I read romance novels, I usually read like historical romance novels, and this one's, you know, definitely a more, or like a very modern tale romance novel, and I liked it, and it's, you know, very realistic at most points. There are some points, of course, it's a romance novel, they seem a little unrealistic, but this one wasn't that bad. I think there were like very real, I don't know, arguments or like points to like their emotions of how they felt within this book, where sometimes I feel like they're just being way dramatic in romance novels. But this one, yeah, I don't know, even though I didn't like it, it seemed kind of very realistic in a sense. I don't know, maybe because it was a modern romance novel instead of, you know, a historical one, but I guess that is one point I liked about it. There were like very realistic points, I guess. But this one has the boy and girl meet in an elevator when it like shuts down in a hotel, and eventually the guy like asks the girl to go to a wedding with him that is like his ex-girlfriend's wedding, and she agrees, and you know, and they, you know, hit it off, and they eventually like end up spending weekends together, flying back and forth from where he lives and she lives. And the whole time they're like, oh, this is just casual or whatever. And so they eventually have to like work through like actually saying they want to take this further than this was just a random weird thing that happened. And I believe there are other books to like correspond with this book. Like usually romance novels, besides the Bridgerton series who has like 8 books, usually they have like 3 or so that are connected through the characters. I haven't really decided if I'm gonna like continue with this series, even though I know the next book is about one of the side characters I actually did really like. I still haven't decided whether I want to read it or not, maybe eventually. But I don't know if I liked the story enough to like continue it to read the other 2 with it, or like, you know, read the next story within this series of, but I have a feeling like maybe since they're also going to be like modern, like am I still going to get that to that point where like the big moments don't have that like much amount of feeling toward me, or I don't know if it's the writing or just that it's modern take of romance, which I haven't read a lot of. So maybe I will try out one more, but if I feel the same about it, I don't know how much more modern romance novels I will read. Which is kind of funny to say because the next book I read was also a modern romance. It was the one we chose for our book club. And again, I enjoyed it, but I didn't like it as much. I did enjoy it a little bit more than The Wedding Date, but this one is called The Summer Proposal by V. Keelan, and this one is a fairly new release, but I did like it a little bit more than The Wedding Date. So this one helped me kind of think maybe I could read some more modern take romance, but I definitely lean more towards liking historical romances. Compared to The Wedding Date, where I said you could relate to the characters a little bit more because they seem more realistic, this one wasn't as realistic. It's definitely modern, but the main guy is like a hockey star, an NHL hockey star. I think they even mentioned he was like the captain, and then the girl like is a CEO of her own company, which isn't as unrealistic. I don't know. They were both like so like above a normal like job for most people these days that I feel like that part was kind of unrealistic. I don't know. But basically they meet this guy, the guy interrupts the girl waiting for like a blind date, and she thinks it's her blind date, but it turns out not when the real blind date shows up, but the other guy. I don't even really remember the names right now, but the guy's, you know, a major hockey player, and he like gives her tickets, you know, saying if this date doesn't work out, come to the game. And that's when she finds out he's a hockey player. And eventually they like go on dates together, and there's this like whole side story of her being like formally engaged but like sort of still with him, but he's like living in England. It's like this whole weird situation, which was again not very realistic. I don't know, maybe it is for some people, but for me I didn't see it being relatable. But the whole thing is that they're like, oh, this is just gonna be a summer fling because he's like moving away to a different team. Her ex-fiance but still dating dude is apparently like coming back later, and she's like, yeah, I'm totally gonna get back with him. Again, with the Wedding Date and this story, they both thought it was gonna be like a temporary thing, and then they all caught feels. And then at the end they have this whole like medical drama that happens to the guy, and so it's very, even though I like the story overall more than The Wedding Date, it was very more unrealistic. So maybe that's what I like about romance novels, is that they're unrealistic. Maybe that's why I lean more towards the historical ones, because they're unrealistic in many ways. I don't know, I think I'm like learning things about my reading habits of romance novels right now, going over why I liked one more than the other. If you have any thoughts on it, let me know below. But reading this one did make me feel like I would maybe try out modern ones a little bit more, but I'm still sticking to like my historical romance novels as my favorite. I do have to say, like, besides these books that I read, I did like read other things. I'm not really going to talk about them because they weren't like full books. When I was reading these, I like went back to other romance novels that I had read before that I really enjoyed, and so I didn't read them in total, so that's why I didn't really count them as my like what I read count. But they were also like historical romance. There's a series that I read a lot of parts of again this month. One's called Liberty for Paul, and then the other is like Intentions of an Earl, and they're like the connected series of the sisters. They're by Rose Gordon, I believe. But those are some of my favorites that I read in the past. I also like the author Sarah McLean. I've read a lot of books of hers and like her different tri-series of romance novels. So if you are looking for like historical romance series to read, I do like Rose Gordon and Sarah McLean, and I read parts of each of the books that I have from those authors this month, but I didn't include them in my count of books that I've read since I didn't read the whole books again. So yeah, I definitely lean towards more historical romance novels, but I am giving modern ones a more try, along with the modern ones that I've talked about so far. I also have this app on my phone that's like a reading app. I think it's like called Galatea, and it's a reading app with mostly romance novels, and I read a few of them from there, and those are modern ones. They're very high fantasy. They have a lot of like werewolf fantasy ones, and I read a few of them and I liked them. I think the aspect of like the fantasy that makes them unrealistic helped a lot for me liking them. With that app, you can read for free, and then you can like pay, but you have to like watch ads or, you know, wait a certain amount of time to read, like continue reading past a certain point before you can, you know, continue, or you can like pay per month or something. I forget right now, but they have a ton of books. I wouldn't say they're as long a book, but you know, they're a good decent amount size for a romance story. But I also read a few of those this month. So if you want to stick with more modern ones but are okay with like the fantasy aspect of it, I would maybe look into the ones on the app, or like similar type romance stories. Those have a lot of like werewolf aspects to them. So yeah, I'm starting to think like I just like the unrealistic parts of romance novels. That's maybe why I didn't like the other very modern ones as much. But yeah, I'm gonna stick to more my historical ones in the future. And talking about the next book that I read was another Bridgerton book. It's number 4, so it's about Colin, and I knew before reading this book that it was obviously about Colin, but I also knew he got with Penelope, who, if you don't know, I don't think this is a spoiler, but Penelope is Mrs. Whistledown, or Lady Whistledown, the writer of like the column that this novel talks about a lot, or this series talks about a lot. And I was really looking kind of forward to reading this novel since I knew they got together. You know, since they have known each other for such a long time, like how do they eventually get together? And it was kind of like how I expected it to go, but it was a little, I wouldn't say disappointing, but it wasn't as fun, or I don't know, exciting as I thought it would be. You know, finishing this book, I'm like halfway through the Bridgerton series, because there's 8, this is number 4. But I would maybe rank this one a little lower on, you know, the 4 that I've read. I would probably either put it like probably at the bottom so far. Not that I dislike the book. I don't know. It just, the whole aspect of how they got together wasn't as fun as the other ones, I guess. But the whole time it was basically like, he just saw her in a different light. And I was like, what? I know that like happens, but what? I don't know. I didn't like it as much as, you know, the other stories. So I would still say like Benedict's story's my favorite, and then I think like Anthony's, and then Daphne's, and then Colin's. But you know, after reading the 3rd book, and I really enjoyed it, it's my favorite so far, and then reading this one, I'm a little nervous going forward in the series, because I probably still will, you know, finish the series, just because like at this point you've heard a lot about most of the younger siblings, and so like I'm a little nervous that I won't like their story because I know so much about them, and from what I've read of like, I don't know, like reviews of them, it's like they act completely different within their books than they do in the other books. So I'm a little nervous that I won't like them as much. Maybe until I get to like Gregory, because I think he's like the last book, and you haven't really heard that much about him because he's like off at school throughout these other novels. So, but the next book, like the 5th book, is about Eleanor, and she's like one of my favorite side characters. So I'm really kind of nervous I'm not going to like her book or like her story. So I'm a little nervous going forward within this series. But like I said, between all the romance books I read throughout this month and then the other ones that I reread or read on the app, I'm going to take a little break from romance novels. So maybe I'll get to it later. And hopefully by then I will be okay if it's not as good as I hope. But you know, in the other stories they talk a lot about Eleanor, and I think it's Hyacinth, I forget how you actually say her name, but it's like the 2 girls, and then there's one other girl, and then Gregory. I think the other girl's name is Francesca. They also haven't really talked about her, so maybe her book I'll enjoy, and then Gregory's I'll enjoy because I haven't heard as much about them. So maybe I just have to like get through Eleanor and to get to the other ones that I might enjoy a little bit more. if that makes sense. But yeah, Colin and Penelope's story overall was fine, but definitely kind of on the lower end of my liking of the series so far. But yeah, I would say the third one is my favorite. But the last book I've finished so far in this year and in February, I finished yesterday, which was February 28th. Today's March 1st. And that was The Princess Bride by William Goldman. I decided to pick this book up from the library because I've always wanted to read it because The Princess Bride is one of my favorite movies. And I did really enjoy it. If you've seen the movie, obviously you're going to know a lot of, I guess, plot points of this story. But one thing I didn't know about the story is that it's like a story within a story. And it really threw me for a loop because I really believed part of this story that is said when really it's not true at all. And I didn't realize that until the very end of the book. And I had to like look up things on my phone that he mentioned and then read online that it was also not true. And I just sat there and kind of laughed at myself. I was like, I can't believe I read this and believed that it was actually real. And so I was just gonna like give this book 4 stars because I really did obviously like the adventure love story that is shown in the movie. The other part of the story that is also not true but is part of the book. I liked it, but they definitely had slower parts in it. But after I found out that he like really pulled a big one on me and like, I don't know, I believed something that wasn't real and like sat there and laughed at myself, I ended up giving it 5 stars because I was like, I can't believe he actually did that. I don't know. So like I said, early in January, I read a lot of books that made me want to watch movies. This one definitely made me want to watch the movie again. But the ending, when I found out a lot of things that I read weren't real that I thought were sort of real, just kind of left me stunned. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. But overall, like the whole story is very funny. You know, obviously the jokes that are in the movie that you like are in the book. And then there's all this other part that he adds in that are also very funny. And like overall the book was very funny. I enjoyed the writing. And it made me want to read his other books just because like his humor. But then I was like duped so bad with this book. I was like, I don't know if I trust this guy. If I want to read his other, you know, books. You know, is the same thing gonna happen? I don't know. But if you have watched the movie but haven't read the book, I highly recommend it because I want to see if you believe it's true or not. But if you've only seen the movie and haven't really heard or you know read the book, I kind of suggest reading it. See if you believe the same parts that I believed or not. It'll definitely make you laugh. I definitely think it was a good way to end the month because it, you know, had a basic love story in it, but it wasn't as, you know, heavy on the romance and stuff as all the other books and things I've read this month. So it's kind of like a small detox of all that. But I'm definitely going to take a break from like, you know, love stories and romance novels going into March. I already have a plan of like what I want to read, and none of them I think really include a love story. So unless it's like a subplot. So yeah, that was the last book I finished, was The Princess Bride. But overall, I really enjoyed all the books I've read or reread in January and February. Let me know down below if you read any of these and what your thoughts on them were. I'm really excited to get into the books I kind of picked out or want to read within March and maybe April going forward. And so far throughout this year, I'm doing really well. I'm like, you know, getting through books and getting a lot read. So hopefully that can continue throughout the year, especially since I'm enjoying most of them that I read very much. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Again, let me know down in the comments if you read any of these, your thoughts on them, any suggestions of books I should read in the future, either based on what I said or just in general books you think I should read. I can't wait to continue reading and talk about books next month with you. But until then, if you want to be someone, why not be you? Bye guys, see you in the next video.